In this tutorial, we're going to talk about primary keys and what are the different ways in which Hibernate provides support for primary keys. We have defined a primary key in our previous tutorial itself. I have actually simplified the code here. I've kind of removed all the other properties. I just have the ID and the username alone just for simplicity. So here we had already defined this at ID annotation to denote this particular field as the primary key, and we had given the field a value of 1 and a simple username in order to fill that property value, and then we had saved that using Hibernate. Now what does this at ID do? First of all, it created a primary key column in the table, and it created a column for this user ID, and then it denoted it as a primary key. And then you can use this primary key for fetching data. That's again another thing we saw in a previous tutorial. We can pass the value of the key to a session.get, and then we can get the object itself. Now we'll look at what are the other ways in which Hibernate supports primary keys. Before we get into what Hibernate supports, we'll have a quick discussion about a natural versus a surrogate key. Now, what is a natural key and what is a surrogate key? Let's say, for example, in your application, you have a column that you know for sure has distinct values, and then you know for sure that it's mandatory. Take, for example, a user registration application, and you have people registering by giving out their email address and the first and last name, all those details. Say your business rule dictates that every user needs to have an email ID, and then every user has to provide a distinct unique email ID when they're registering. You cannot have duplicate email IDs. You cannot have two different records that has the same email ID. So in that case, we can have the email address as a primary key. So such columns which actually are there for a business reason, but then you assign one of them to be the primary key. So such keys are called natural keys. The other option is to have something called as a surrogate key, in which case you don't know if any column can be marked as unique. You don't have a column that can be marked as unique, or you anticipate that that could change in the future. So in that case, what you do is you add a new column, and the purpose of the column is to entirely act as a primary key alone. It does not carry any business significance, but you need to have a separate column just to have, just for it to act as a key. So in that case, that's called as a surrogate key. It's kind of like having a serial number column in front of your table. The serial number column does not serve any other purpose, does not carry any data apart from the fact that it's marking out all the different rows as separate, and it has a unique number for each. So having these now that we have these two types of primary keys, we'll look at how Hibernate supports each. Now what's the key that we are using over here? We have something called as user ID, and we have a username. Now if the user ID is specifically for the purpose of declaring a primary key, and then it does not have a business use, then yes, this would be a surrogate key. But if it has a business use, or it's a login ID, for example, and you're making a login ID as a primary key, then that would be a natural key, because a login ID is also used for other purposes like authentication and stuff. So if we are having a natural key, it would make sense for us to provide the value, because it's of business significance. We need to know what the value is, and we need to be able to control it. But if it's a surrogate key, then we can ask Hibernate to do the job for us. Because it really doesn't matter for us what the value is going to be. As far as we know, it can be the the last value plus 1. That would work as well. But we just need to make sure that it's it just has to be unique, and it has to be mandatory. It cannot be optional. It cannot be null. So these two things are something that Hibernate can manage for us. We can tell Hibernate to generate a surrogate key for us whenever we're using such a surrogate key. Say, for example, this user ID happens to be a surrogate key. I've just added this value here, but I don't need it for any other reason apart from using it as an ID. So in that case, we can ask Hibernate to generate this value for us every time we do an insert. I don't have to create this ID every time. I don't have to pass it to Hibernate. Hibernate can automatically generate and manage the newly created objects keys. So say I have to insert a new user, all I have to do is to set the username, and then Hibernate will take care of creating the right user ID for me. Now, if I had to supply the surrogate key myself, then what would I have to do? I have to first look up what is the last surrogate key ID that was created. Probably we have 500 users, and the last user ID that was inserted was 500. So I will have to add one to it and then insert user ID 501. So this is something that I don't have to do if I use Hibernate's help. Hibernate will do that work and it will generate a primary key for me. So I can use that functionality of Hibernate by specifying another annotation here called at generated value. What add generated value means is it's asking Hibernate to generate this value for me. I'm not going to generate this myself. Now Hibernate is going to look at the data type of this property. It's an integer, so it's going to generate a new integer for me, and then it's going to add that value. So now I don't have to pass a user ID value. I'm just going to set the username, and then when I do a save, it's going to save the value. So just to demonstrate that, let me add one more object here. I'll call this user2, and let's say user2.set username second user, and I'll save both of them. I'll save session.save user2. Okay, I'll save and run this. So there you can see it has inserted these two values. But notice what's happening here. It's done a next val of Hibernate sequence. So what's happening is Hibernate is maintaining a sequence internally, and it's generating the user ID depending on the sequence. It just gets the next value of that sequence and then uses that next value to insert the user ID. This was not happening before because we used to pass the user ID, but now that we have marked it as a generated value, Hibernate is getting this value from the sequence and then it's inserting it. Now let's test the data. There you go, user ID 1 and 2 has been inserted with first user and second user. Now this generated value has something called as a strategy. So there is this configuration called strategy equals. Now here you can see there are 4 values here belonging to the generation type enumeration. We have auto, identity, sequence, and table. Now what's happening if you do not specify any strategy is that it's going for strategy as generation type dot auto. Now what is this auto generation type? It just means that we will let Hibernate make a decision as to what is the strategy it needs to use in order to come up with these unique primary keys. Now you can have more control over this. You can specify one of these other options here. So the other options being identity, sequence, and table. So identity means that it's going to use, Hibernate is going to use identity columns, and it's going to generate that. Now what is identity column? It's a feature which provided in some of the databases. It's not a generic feature that's available in all the databases. I believe SQL Server and MySQL, I could be wrong, but I think those two databases provide this identity column feature. So if you're using one of those databases, you can say generation type is identity, in which case Hibernate is going to use that feature of the database in order to come up with the unique primary keys. Sequence is something, it's called as sequence high-low in Hibernate. So sequence has it uses the sequence object in the database in order to come up with the unique key. I think that's what's happening here. It's using a Hibernate sequence object. A sequence object is something that you can have in the database in order to maintain sequences, and you can use that. You can add sequence. You can, when you say a next val, it automatically pulls up the next value and then updates the sequence so that subsequent next vals pull up the next data. So it's something that databases manage by themselves, and you can use sequence to come up with unique values for the primary key. Table is another option. You can have a separate table, and that table will have a record of what is the last used primary key so that you can increment it and get the next value. So again, if you use this table option, Hibernate is going to create a separate table and use that for generating the primary key. So most of these depend on the database that you are using. So auto is the recommended option. If you use generation type.auto, that means that you're going to leave it to Hibernate to make the best decision depending on the database that you're connecting to.